Is socialism inherently authoritarian? That is a very common question / argument against socialism. Among rightists like libertarians, small government conservatives, or even anarcho-capitalists, you will very often find that socialism is bad because socialism is authoritarian, which inherently makes it less free than whatever their political goal happens to be. So let's examine this. This is the definition of socialism, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. As you can see, it says nothing about authoritarianism. Matter of fact, you can have an economy which completely follows this definition without having a government at all. That's something anarcho-communists could have told you before. So there, the answer to the title is no. You can have socialism without any authority, therefore it is not inherently authoritarian. Thanks for watching, make sure to... But wait. If socialism isn't inherently authoritarian, then why is it that every single historical example of socialism featured an authoritarian government? Is there something about socialist ideas that made these governments be that way? And how can we be sure that it won't turn out this way again if we attempt socialism one more time? The rightist argument goes that every time socialism was tried, it turned authoritarian, which is a bad thing. And because of this precedent, we shouldn't even try to achieve a better society, because if it happened then, it could happen again. So in this video, we'll analyze why those countries turned out that way, and whether it is really the inevitable result of socialist ideas. In order to make this video make sense, I need to complete the impossible task and define what I mean by socialist country. This definition allows for a lot of room for interpretation. For example, in the Soviet Union, the state owned the industry. Does that follow this definition or not? Does the state represent the community or doesn't it? And what about Yugoslavia, which had socialist businesses in a market environment? What about modern-day China? Is that socialist? The answer is, that depends on who you ask. Oftentimes, socialists will include or exclude different countries based on their personal opinions about those countries. For example, many anarchists consider the USSR bad, so their definitions of socialism don't include that country. Matter of fact, some anarcho-communists say that true socialism cannot exist with the government, so they flat out deny that there has ever been a socialist country or that there ever can be one. It would be really easy to argue that real socialism hasn't been tried yet, but the 5% of my audience who are rightists hate this argument, because it dodges all of the things they have to say against past attempts of socialism. And I don't want to dodge anything here. I want to engage with the argument to the best of my ability. For that, I'm adopting the opposite view. For the purposes of this video, every country that ever called itself socialist will be counted as socialist nation. Yes, I'm aware that by that definition, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, which my leftist audience knows why this may not be the most accurate assertion, but whatever, this is our definition. This means, for this video I will count the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, the entirety of Eastern Europe, as well as much of Africa and South America, as socialists. Depending on the time period, of course, there is no socialism in modern-day Eastern Europe. Looking at those countries, we can see a lot of authoritarianism, secret police, one-party states, centralized bureaucracies, dictators and gulags. Truly Orwell's nightmares. Except Orwell frequently reported people to the secret police, so Orwell's dreams. So, why is that? Why is there so much authoritarianism? That's what this section is about. For now, I will only explain these arguments and ideas. The counter-arguments will come later. There is the idea, especially online, that socialism is inherently authoritarian because socialism uses a centrally planned economy which inherently promotes a rule of the few over the many. All examples of socialism had decentralized economies. So the argument goes that therefore socialism is inherently authoritarian. So, reason 1, centralized economies are inherently authoritarian. You may have heard about Terry Eagleton's book titled Why Marx Was Right. I definitely recommend it since it's a nice 21st century look at the past, present and future of socialism, and the entire following argument is borrowed from it. On the topic of bureaucracy in the USSR, Eagleton makes a materialist argument. The theory is that to reach socialism or communism, you need the people to have a lot of materialist things, like coats and shoes. And of course, before the socialist revolution in Russia, most had neither shoes nor coats. So when Lenin and his party got in charge, they somehow had to create these products and then distribute them. Of course, they didn't open 10,000 tailor shops. They just created one big efficient factory that mass-produced coats. And then they somehow had to manage this factory and the distribution of the products throughout the entire country. And because of the need to do this for every single product, a centralized bureaucracy developed as a result of the Russian conditions. So reason 2 why socialism is authoritarian, a poorly developed country would develop a central bureaucracy when trying to reach socialism. That's the Eagleton take. There is another explanation for why those countries turned out so authoritarian. It could be because none of them had democracy before they reached socialism. China was a feudalist empire or a fascist dictatorship, depending on the region. Russia was a czarist autocracy. Maybe they developed in authoritarian ways because that's what they knew worked. Both the people and the revolutionaries may have believed that democracy is inherently unstable, which is actually kind of true when compared to a dictatorship. So reason 3 why these countries were authoritarian, because they had no culture of democracy and rather one of authoritarianism. There is something else these countries have in common: civil wars. Every single one of these countries only turned socialist after fighting a civil war against anti-communist forces. The Soviet Union, 5 years of civil war, 8 million dead. China, 15 million dead over 13 years, with a break for World War II in it. And of course, the Eastern Bloc countries didn't experience a civil war before being socialist, but they did experience fascist conquest, occupation, and liberation by the Soviet Union. Every time socialism came into a country, that country was first ravaged by war. So it makes sense that the leaders would grasp onto power tightly and make sure they can't be overthrown by a second civil war or by the millions of angry and potentially armed citizens which were on the other side of that civil war. And this is of course another reason to turn away from liberal democracy. If half your country just fought against you, who is to say they won't vote you out? And of course, for the one in the government, authoritarianism is best. So I propose that we're seeing some survivorship bias here. The reason all socialist countries in history were authoritarian is because due to civil wars, the non-authoritarian ones were destroyed. I know there are many libertarian leftists who wrote angry comments when I said that every example of a socialist nation in history was authoritarian, because this is of course not true. There were libertarian and sometimes even anarchist revolutions as well. The idea that all socialist states were authoritarian is a widespread myth. For example, Magnovia, aka the Free Territory, an anarchist region in modern-day Ukraine, which was fighting for their goals around the time of the Russian Revolution. And they were the opposite of authoritarian. They really hated the Soviets, which is why they were eventually attacked and conquered by the Soviet government. Then there was the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, aka the National Confederation of Labor. It was a faction in the Spanish Civil War, an anarcho-syndicalist one to be exact. And of course there was the Kronstadt Rebellion, yet again in the USSR. I would need more time to pay any of these the respect they deserve, so I will leave it at this. Just take it that there are definitely examples of socialist revolutionaries who are not authoritarian and who are committed to the ideas of anarchism. This is also the counter to the idea that as soon as you have revolutionaries take action, they will turn into evil dictators and not give up their power, because the leaders of these revolutions didn't do that. But these libertarian revolutions have something in common. They all stopped existing within a few years. There are many different explanations, and leftists love arguing about it, but there are some possible reasons. Maybe libertarian leftist ideas are just not capable of winning in a civil war. They may be better for the people living in them, and in theory they definitely are, but in praxis they are quickly crushed by fascism or more authoritarian forms of socialism. It's easier to win a war if you attack civilians and force conscript people, neither of which libertarian socialists would do. This could lead to them being destroyed by fascist counter-revolutionaries. For this reason, many still support the Soviet form of a revolution, despite more liberal and kind of better forms of socialism existing, because no matter what you think about the USSR, the strong state and large army kept it safe. Of course, you could also say that it wasn't the fault of liberal politics that these libertarian socialist revolutions failed. They were up against insurmountable odds in every instance, and this is true. And maybe the next libertarian socialist revolution will be more successful. Personally, I would want it to be. But historically, it kinda looks like that because of the civil wars, libertarian socialist countries, communes, whatever, failed, and that only the strong, centralized, and tightly controlled ones survived, which is what survivorship bias means. So, reason for why these countries were authoritarians, because they had to be to survive. One note here, 2 of the mentioned revolutions were crushed by the USSR, which to this day causes infighting on the left. I would like to ask you not to argue about this as much. It was 100 years ago, and we need to get stuff done nowadays. And we are a lot more capable of doing that if we move on. Yes, Trotsky crushing the Kronstadt Rebellion was a dick move. But none of the modern Marxist-Leninists or anarchists were there at the time. So there is no point in blaming each other. Please, work together. There are so many capitalists who deserve to be argued with. So focus on them, please. So there we have some ideas for why socialist countries turned that authoritarian. And that begs the question, will it happen like that again? Are we doomed to repeat it? So I will go over these 4 reasons again and see whether they're inevitable or whether we can adapt and learn from them. First of all, the idea that socialism is inherently authoritarian because it is inherently centralized. Nothing about the definition of socialism says there needs to be a central control at all. Matter of fact, there can be market socialism, decentrally planned socialism, or AI planned socialism. I have videos on all of those. This means the argument that socialism is authoritarian because it is centralized is wrong, because there can be many non-centralized forms of socialism, and those existed historically, for example in Yugoslavia and Argentina. So, reason 1 is a fail, there doesn't have to be a central government. Before I mentioned the take of Terry Eagleton, who said that the USSR developed a central bureaucracy because Russia was so poor. His argument continues that because today everyone already has a coat and shoes, there would be no need for such a bureaucracy. This means he believed that because of the different conditions we live in, the next socialist revolution wouldn't need to be authoritarian. If there is no need for everyone to receive material products, then there is no need for centralization. So this isn't an avenue to authoritarianism either. The next reason these countries might have fallen for authoritarianism was that they had no history of democracy. And of course, we live in modern Western democracies, so our culture is inherently more critical of authoritarian and less likely to turn to authoritarianism. So that likely won't be a problem for future attempts of socialism. The only cause for authoritarianism that is left is war. And there isn't much I can say about that. If the next socialist revolution is immediately attacked by counter-revolutionaries, it may still turn authoritarian, just to survive, or it may stick to its values and be destroyed. Of course, we don't want that. We want a peaceful transition to socialism, both to preserve liberal ideas and freedom, and to avoid a civil war which would destroy the country and kill many people. So, This one is the most likely cause for a socialist revolution turning authoritarianism, a hard-fought war. There are ways around that, of course. A peaceful takeover, overwhelming force, or democratic takeover are some ways this can be avoided. But of course, it's not up to us whether the US military will start a war against the next socialist nation. And no doubt, if they start a war and the revolution turns authoritarian to protect itself, they will use that to justify hating the revolutionaries. Just like how the USA sent support to the anti-Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War, which caused the USSR to become militarized, and then the USSR called the Soviets an evil empire because they protected themselves against countries that wanted to harm them, like the USA. In the final section of this video, I would like to ask the question, what even is authoritarianism? Before, I just accepted that the socialist nations were authoritarian. Some features I named were secret police, one-party states, centralized bureaucracies, dictators and gulags. But the closer you look at the USSR and China and the other ones, the fewer reasons you have to call them authoritarian. Let's pull out the definition. Britannica.com says, authoritarianism denotes any political system that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or small elite that is not constitutionally responsible for the body of the people. And does that describe the USSR? I have a whole video on this, and to be honest, according to the Soviet constitution, the party was 100% responsible to the body of the people. So the USSR doesn't even fit the definition for authoritarianism, and neither does China. And if you make the definition broad enough to encompass the USSR, then your definition also includes the USA. Think about it. Secret police, centralized bureaucracy, secret government prisons that arrest people without charges, a political system that doesn't represent the people and only benefits party members. If you want to call the USSR authoritarian, then call it that. I won't stop you. But if you do that, you have to admit that the USA is at least as authoritarian as the USSR has ever been. And of course, we are trained to inherently view authoritarianism as bad. But just calling someone or something authoritarian isn't an argument. It doesn't provide any evidence on how good or bad that thing is. So the question whether socialism is inherently authoritarian is kind of empty because it doesn't judge socialism at all. It just adds a bad label. Make sure to subscribe and like and stuff. I would like to thank my patrons for supporting me, and I especially thank Comrade Asshole, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Noah, Alki, Attila Nemetz, Bryn Floas, German Pineapple, Comrade Jupe, Daniel Hyman, Dr. Grimm, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gavi Gita, Herdington Gerdington, Joshua Clark, Masia Rojek, Nane Epema, Neil Banderi, Nicholas Wiggins, Nora Quinn, Raymond DeVille, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Stefan, Hugo Castelos, Glastrup, Pote and Trey.